The palace of Susa shimmered under the relentless Persian sun, its white marble columns rising like giants from the earth, its walls inlaid with lapis lazuli and gold, its gardens perfumed with myrrh and frankincense. The air itself seemed to shimmer with wealth and power, as though the very atmosphere had been purchased by the empire that stretched from India to Ethiopia, from the edges of the known world to the heart of civilization. 127 provinces bowed before the throne of Xerxes, the great king, the king of kings, whose word was law and whose anger was death. In this palace of unimaginable splendor, where the ceilings were painted with scenes of conquest and the floors were paved with precious stones, where servants moved like silent shadows and courtiers whispered secrets that could topple kingdoms, there lived a young Jewish woman whose Hebrew name was Hadassah, though the Persians called her Esther, meaning star. She was beautiful beyond measure, her face like the dawn, her eyes deep as wells, her bearing graceful as a gazelle. But beneath the silk and jewels, beneath the crown that rested on her dark hair, beneath the cosmetics and perfumes that adorned her skin, Esther carried a secret that could cost her everything. She was a Jew, a daughter of Abraham, a child of the covenant, living in exile among a people who did not know her God. And on this particular night, as she stood alone in her chambers, looking out over the darkened city, her hands trembling, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom, Esther faced a choice that would define not only her own life, but the survival of her entire people. In 3 days, she would walk uninvited into the throne room of the most powerful man on earth, risking instant death. In 3 days, she would break the law that no one could approach the king without being summoned, knowing that unless he extended his golden scepter, the guards would cut her down where she stood. In 3 days, she would step between her people and annihilation, armed with nothing but her beauty, her courage, and her desperate faith in the God of her fathers who had been silent for so long. But how had she come to this moment? How had an orphaned Jewish girl become queen of the Persian Empire? And how had her people come to stand on the very edge of genocide, with a date already set for their extermination throughout all 127 provinces? To understand Esther's story, we must go back to the beginning, back to a royal banquet that lasted 180 days, back to a drunken king and a defiant queen, back to the moment when the throne of Persia became vacant and the search began for a new queen that would change the course of history. King Xerxes, whom some translations call Ahasuerus, was the son of Darius the Great and the grandson of Cyrus, who had conquered Babylon and allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem nearly a century earlier. Xerxes ruled from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, one of several capitals in the vast Persian Empire. He was a man of immense pride, legendary temper, and absolute power. When he wanted to display the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty, he threw a banquet that lasted for 180 days, 6 full months of feasting and drinking, of entertainment and access, inviting all the officials and servants of his provinces, the army chiefs of Persia and Media, the nobles and governors, to witness his magnificence. When these days were completed, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 more days for all the people present in the citadel of Susa, from the greatest to the least, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels of various kinds, and the royal wine flowed freely according to the king's bounty. The drinking was done according to the law. There was no compulsion, for the king had given orders to all the officials of his palace to do as each person desired. On the 7th day of this final banquet, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, which is to say, when he was thoroughly drunk, when his judgment was clouded and his pride was inflamed, he commanded 7 eunuchs, who served him, to bring Queen Vashti before him, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the peoples and the officials, for she was lovely to look at. The king wanted to show her off like a prized possession, to parade her before his drunken guests, as though she were merely another treasure in his collection, another jewel to demonstrate his wealth and power. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. She refused to be displayed like an object, to be ogled by drunken men, to reduce herself to mere decoration for her husband's ego. Her refusal was an act of dignity, of self-respect, perhaps even of courage. But in the rigidly hierarchical world of ancient Persia, where the king's word was absolute law, where defiance of royal command was unthinkable, her refusal was also an act of catastrophic rebellion. The king became furious. His anger burned within him. He consulted with the wise men who knew the times, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who saw the king's face and sat first in the kingdom, asking them what should be done to Queen Vashti according to law, because she had not obeyed the command of King Xerxes delivered by the eunuchs. These advisors, these manipulators of power, these men who understood that the personal had become political, that Vashti's defiance threatened the entire social order, gave their counsel. Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king but also all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will rebel against the king's officials, and there will be no end of contempt and wrath. They advise that if it please the king, let the royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Xerxes, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, vast as it is, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the officials, and the king did as the advisors proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in his own script, and to every people in his own language, that every man be master in his own household. Queen Vashti was banished, stripped of her crown and position, sent away from the presence of the king forever. And while this seems harsh to us, while we might sympathize with Vashti's dignity and resent the king's drunken arrogance, we must recognize that in the mysterious providence of God, this moment of royal anger and feminine defiance opened the door for a Jewish orphan to become queen of Persia at precisely the moment when her people would need someone in the palace, someone with access to the king, someone who could intercede when no one else could reach him. After these things, when the anger of King Xerxes had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in the citadel of Susa under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. Now there was a Jew in the citadel of Susa, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem, among the captives carried away with Jeconiah king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon had carried away. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter. Try to imagine what this meant. Esther was an orphan, a girl who had known loss from her earliest days, who had no mother to hold her when she cried, no father to protect her and guide her. She was part of a minority community living in exile, descendants of those who had been torn from Jerusalem and dragged in chains to Babylon over a century earlier. Though some Jews had returned to rebuild Jerusalem under Zerubbabel and later under Ezra and Nehemiah, many had remained in Persia, building lives and businesses, raising families, trying to maintain their identity and faith in the foreign land. Mordecai had taken in his orphan cousin and raised her as his own daughter, giving her love and stability, teaching her the ways of their people, instilling in her the faith of Abraham even as they lived surrounded by paganism and idolatry. When the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in the citadel of Susa in the custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in the custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. This was not a voluntary beauty pageant. This was a royal decree, a gathering of young women from across the empire, beautiful virgins taken from their families and brought to the palace to be prepared as potential brides for the king. For these young women and their families, there was no choice, no option to decline. When the king's man came for you, you went. Imagine the terror, the uncertainty, the grief of leaving everything you knew to enter the royal harem, knowing that even if you were chosen as queen, you would never see your family again in the same way, that your entire life had been irrevocably altered by forces beyond your control. But the text tells us something remarkable. The young woman pleased Haggai and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther found favor in the eyes of this powerful eunuch, the man who controlled access to the king, who determined which women would be presented and in what order, who could make the process easier or harder for any given candidate. This was not mere physical beauty, though Esther certainly possessed that. This was something in her character, her bearing, her manner that caused people to want to help her, to show her kindness, to give her preferential treatment. Mordecai had commanded Esther not to make known her people or her kindred, and she obeyed him. So Esther did not reveal that she was Jewish. This decision to hide her identity would prove crucial later, but it must have been agonizing for her. She could not observe all the dietary laws openly. She could not explain the true reason for any of her practices or beliefs. She had to be constantly careful with her words, constantly vigilant, constantly aware that one slip could reveal her secret. Every day she lived with the knowledge that she was not fully known, not fully herself, carrying a hidden identity that could never be casually shared. Every day, Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. He could not speak to her, could not enter the harem, could not offer her direct comfort or counsel, but he came every day faithfully, hoping perhaps to catch a glimpse of her, to receive some word of how she fared, demonstrating a father's love, even though he had no biological obligation to this orphan cousin. His faithfulness in this small daily practice reveals the depth of his devotion to her. The text describes the preparation process in detail. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go in to King Xerxes, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was a regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women, when the young woman went in to the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. 12 months of preparation, 12 months of beauty treatments, cosmetics, perfumes, oils, 12 months of being shaped and molded and adorned for one purpose, to please the king. 12 months in which to contemplate your future, to hope and fear in equal measure, to wonder what kind of man this king was who had banished his previous queen for refusing to be displayed, who held the power of life and death in his hands, who could elevate you to unimaginable heights or discard you to live out your days in obscurity in the harem, neither wife nor free woman. When Esther's turn came to go in to the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. This shows her wisdom, her humility, her willingness to listen to those who knew the king's preferences better than she did. She did not trust in her own judgment, but in the counsel of one who understood the king's taste and desires. And we are told that Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. There was something about her that drew people, that made them respond with warmth and kindness, something beyond mere physical beauty. The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. The orphan Jewish girl had become queen of the Persian Empire. Hadassah, whose name meant myrtle, became Esther, the star shining in the darkness of a pagan palace, placed by the mysterious providence of God in a position of influence at precisely the moment when her people would need her. But Esther still kept her identity secret. Even as queen, even crowned and elevated, she maintained her silence about her people and her faith, because Mordecai had commanded her and Esther obeyed him just as she had when she was under his care. The text emphasizes this obedience, this faithfulness to her adoptive father's wisdom, this continuation of the relationship, even though her circumstances had dramatically changed. She had not forgotten who she was or where she came from. She had not let power and position separate her from her roots. She remained, in her heart, a daughter of Abraham, even as she wore the crown of Persia. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, meaning he held some official position in the palace administration, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold became angry and sought to lay hands on King Xerxes. The details are not given, but a conspiracy formed a plot to assassinate the king. And the thing became known to Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. This incident seems minor, almost a footnote, but it will prove crucial. Mordecai had saved the king's life, and his deed was recorded in the official records. But apparently, he received no immediate reward or recognition. The good deed was done, noted, and seemingly forgotten. How often in our own lives do we do right and receive no acknowledgement, serve faithfully and see no immediate fruit, act with integrity, and watch others receive the credit? Mordecai could have become bitter, could have regretted his loyalty, could have wondered why he bothered, but he had done what was right simply because it was right, and God was keeping accounts even when men forgot. After these things, King Xerxes promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him, and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow down or pay homage. We must pause here to understand the significance of this refusal. Haman is identified as an Agagite, meaning he was a descendant of Agag, king of the Amalekites. The Amalekites were ancient enemies of Israel, the people who had attacked the Israelites from behind when they were fleeing Egypt, striking down the weak and vulnerable who straggled at the rear of the column. God had commanded Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites, but Saul had disobeyed, sparing King Agag and the best of the livestock. 1 Samuel chapter 15. The prophet Samuel had then executed Agag himself, but clearly some Agagites had survived and prospered. Now, centuries later, a descendant of that ancient enemy had risen to the highest position in the Persian court. Mordecai is identified as a Benjaminite, a descendant of Kish, the same tribal and family line as King Saul. So we have here a continuation of an ancient conflict, Benjaminite versus Agagite. The descendant of the king who failed to complete God's command facing the descendant of the king who should have been destroyed. When Mordecai refused to bow to Haman, he was not merely being stubborn or disrespectful. He was refusing to honor the enemy of his people, refusing to show reverence to one whom God had marked for destruction. Whether the other Jews bowed to Haman, we're not told, but Mordecai, faithful Mordecai, would not bend his knee. The king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" They spoke to him day after day, urging him to conform, to bend, to compromise, but he would not listen to them. Then they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. They wanted to see if his religious identity would be accepted as an excuse for his refusal, or whether he would be punished for his defiance. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So, as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Read that again and let the horror of it sink in. Because one Jew refused to bow to him, Haman decided to exterminate all the Jews throughout the entire Persian Empire. This was not rational anger or proportionate revenge. This was genocidal rage, the same demonic hatred that would manifest again and again throughout history whenever the people of God became vulnerable, whenever the serpent's seed sought to destroy the woman's seed, whenever the enemy of souls found a human instrument willing to carry out his murderous intent. Haman's fury was not merely personal, it was spiritual, cosmic, a manifestation of the ancient hatred of Satan for the people through whom the Messiah would come. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Xerxes, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots before Haman day after day, month after month, until the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Haman and his advisors cast lots, using some form of divination or chance to determine the most auspicious day for carrying out his planned genocide. This was how decisions were often made in the ancient pagan world, consulting omens, casting lots, seeking the guidance of false gods and demonic powers. Ironically, the very mechanism Haman used to choose the date for the Jews' destruction became the mechanism of his own downfall, for the lot fell on a date nearly a year away, giving Esther and Mordecai time to act. The pagans thought they were consulting fate, but they were actually submitting to the providence of the one true God who rules over all things, who works through even the lot cast into the lap to accomplish his purposes. Proverbs 16:33. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." Notice the rhetorical strategy here. Haman did not mention the Jews by name. He did not tell the king that he was angry at one specific Jew. He presented the matter as a concern for the king's interests, portraying the Jews as a disloyal and problematic population whose very existence threatened the stability of the empire. He appealed to xenophobia, to the fear of those who are different, to the suspicion of minorities who maintain their distinct identity, and he offered an enormous bribe, 10,000 talents of silver, an almost unimaginable sum, perhaps equivalent to 2/3 of the entire annual revenue of the Persian Empire, demonstrating both his personal wealth and the wealth he expected to plunder from the Jews he planned to exterminate. The king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you." The casual evil of this moment is breathtaking. The king did not ask who these people were, did not inquire about their supposed crimes, did not investigate whether they actually posed any threat. He simply handed over his authority to Haman, giving him the power to issue any decree in the king's name with the force of imperial law. Xerxes was willing to authorize genocide without even knowing whom he was condemning. The monarch who ruled 127 provinces did not care about justice or truth. He cared only about his own comfort and the opinion of his favorite courtier. Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict, according to all that Haman commanded, was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces and to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script and every people in its own language. It was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces, with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. and the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Picture this scene. While the king and Haman reclined in the palace, drinking wine and celebrating their power, while they treated genocide as casually as one might swat a fly, the city outside descended into chaos. Jews heard the decree and began to wail. Their neighbors looked at them with new eyes, some with pity, some with greed, already calculating what plunder they might gain when the appointed day came. Families gathered in terror, trying to comprehend that their entire community, from the youngest infant to the oldest grandmother, had been marked for death on a specific date nearly a year away. They would live under this sentence, this countdown, knowing that unless something changed, they had less than 12 months to live. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. The grief was universal, spreading across the empire like a wave of darkness. The Jews fasted and prayed, mourning their approaching destruction, crying out to God for mercy, even though many of them had probably grown comfortable in exile, had perhaps allowed their faith to cool, had maybe stopped expecting God to act dramatically in their lives. Now, facing annihilation, they rediscovered their desperate need for divine intervention. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai, so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Esther was in the palace, insulated from the streets, unaware of what had happened. When she heard that Mordecai was in mourning, her first thought was to help him privately, to send him clothes so he could end his public display of grief. But Mordecai refused. This was not personal grief that could be covered up with new garments. This was communal catastrophe that required Esther to understand and act. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. Command her. Mordecai was commanding the queen of Persia, the woman who had been elevated above him in status and power because he understood that she had a responsibility, that her position was not random chance or mere good fortune but divine providence, that God had placed her in the palace for this very moment. And Hathach came and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come in to the king these 30 days. Esther's response reveals her terror. The law was absolute. No one could approach the king unbidden without risking immediate execution. The king could choose to extend his scepter and grant them life, or he could allow the guards to kill them where they stood. And Esther had not been summoned to the king in 30 days, a long time, suggesting perhaps that his interest in her had waned, that she may have already fallen out of favor, that approaching him now could be especially dangerous. She was saying, in effect, I could die just trying to speak to him, and I have no assurance he will even listen to me. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. These words have echoed across centuries, becoming one of the most famous lines in all of Scripture, for such a time as this. Mordecai was making several crucial points. First, Esther's position would not protect her. When the decree was executed, she would die along with all the other Jews, for her identity would certainly be discovered. Second, God would deliver his people even if Esther remained silent. Deliverance would come from another place, because God's purposes cannot be thwarted by human fear or failure. But third, and most importantly, Mordecai suggested that perhaps Esther's entire life, all the tragedy and loss, all the strange providences that had brought an orphan Jewish girl to the throne of Persia, had been preparing her for this exact moment, this crisis, this opportunity to save her people. For such a time as this is a theology of providence, a recognition that our lives are not random, that our positions and opportunities are not accidents, that God may be preparing us through all our experiences for a moment of calling that we cannot yet see. Esther had been an orphan, which made her available to be raised by Mordecai. She had been beautiful, which made her eligible for the king's selection. She had found favor with everyone, which had advanced her above the other candidates. She had been chosen as queen, which gave her access to the king. She had kept her identity secret, which meant she had not yet been identified as one of the condemned. Every detail of her life, including the painful ones, had positioned her for this moment. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. If I perish, I perish." 5 words that contain more courage than 1,000 battle cries. Esther had moved from fear to faith, from self-protection to self-sacrifice, from I could die to I accept that I might die, and I will act anyway. But notice what she did first. She called for a fast. She did not rely on her own beauty or cleverness. She did not trust in her position or her previous favor with the king. She called for her people to fast and pray, to cry out to God for 3 days and 3 nights, to seek divine intervention, because human strategies would not be enough. This fast was not explicitly described as prayer, perhaps because Esther was being cautious even in her communication, or perhaps because prayer was so assumed as part of fasting that it did not need to be mentioned. But the purpose was clear. They were seeking God's favor, asking him to move the king's heart, pleading for mercy and deliverance. For 3 days, the Jews of Susa fasted and prayed, while Esther prepared herself for what might be her final act. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. Imagine this moment. Esther arrayed in her finest garments, adorned with all her jewelry and cosmetics, looking every inch the queen, but knowing that beneath the splendor her heart was pounding, her hands were trembling, her entire future balanced on a knife's edge. She stepped into the inner court where she had no legal right to be, where her presence alone was a crime punishable by instant death. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. The king extended the scepter. She would live. The relief must have been overwhelming, the rush of adrenaline, the sudden release of hell breath. God had moved the king's heart. The fast had been heard. The first impossible obstacle had been cleared, and the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom." The king was pleased to see her, intrigued by her unexpected appearance, generous in his response. He offered her up to half his kingdom, a conventional royal hyperbole, perhaps, but still an indication of great favor and willingness to grant her petition. And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." Here is where Esther's wisdom became evident. She did not immediately blurt out her request. She did not say, "Please reverse the decree that will kill my people." She invited the king and Haman to a private banquet, creating an intimate setting, appealing to the king's love of feasting, including Haman, to avoid arousing his suspicion. She was playing a careful game, timing her revelation, building toward her petition. Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." The king was growing impatient, eager to know what Esther wanted, why she had taken the risk of approaching him unbidden. But still, Esther delayed. "My wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as